Looking at our monthly financials, current year-to-date revenue collections indicates we're about $1.3 million unfavorable. The majority of that we'll talk about, as we've already discussed a number of times, because it actually led to a savings down the road. So, Mr. Lynch, if you could go to the next slide, please. So we are looking at a $2.2 million revenue year-to-date at this point, and we're looking at September collections versus last September. But if you remember, we were down in August because of waiting on a TIF payment. It actually came in the day after the board meeting, or the day of the board meeting, excuse me. So that payment now clocks into September, so it's a timing, basically a timing issue. And we're looking at about $969,000 more revenue this year, lower this year than we were last year at this time, and again, most likely due to timing issues from a split on our collection from the prior year. Overall, $1.3 million to the positive, which is what we would have expected based on our appropriations last month. When I gave the presentation, I said we're probably expecting close to $109 million in revenue. This is showing that projection that we are up to about $109 million in revenue, primarily, as I said, last month because of increased returns on our interest on our investments that we have. Looking at our expenses, our actual expenses for the month were up $3.1 million. The majority of that coming from transfers that we transferred out last month as a result to fund our incentive that we had for our retirements. And again, that transfer out, doing it in 1 year instead of over 3 years, helped us save almost $300,000 in the life of that in our forecast. Year to date, that causes us to be, Mr. Lynch, $2.6 million above expenditures. But again, if you look at the total number of expenditures on the bottom right hand, we're looking at a $14 million, $14.7 million expenditure, which is about what we had last month in our appropriations. So we're trending to that. So as I update my November forecast to our new appropriations based on our revenue and our expense projections, we'll see that those will come to be more closely aligned in the future. So one of the things there's been a lot of talk lately around the state, and it's coming up in Ohio in fiscal year, or in calendar year 24 with the reappraisal. And everybody asks, and because we have 2 levies on the docket, it's also been coming up with regards to how do changes in property values affect property taxes and school district revenue. You know, we've heard across the state, I heard Franklin County seeing appraisal values increases upwards of 40%. You know, is the district going to receive a 40% increase in their property tax revenue from the taxpayer because of that? And the simple answer is no. So I think it's worthwhile for us to spend some time kind of reviewing, educating each other on, you know, how we calculate our property taxes in Ohio. First and foremost, they don't use your market value. They don't take the value that your home would be assessed at. They actually take, or excuse me, appraised at. You actually get the assessed value, which is 35% of that. So you're taxed on 35% of your market value. You take that number and then you multiply it by the effective tax rate, and that gives you your initial tax bill. And then you get some rollbacks and homestead deductions off of that depending upon who your qualifications are. So you get your state paid reimbursements. They take that off, and then we get that money from the state later on from that, and that gives you your current tax bill. There are 3 types of millages in our district, every district across the state of Ohio. You have an inside millage. There's an unvoted millage that we're all are impacted by, up to 10 mills. 4.8 of that accounts for what we get from the district. So the district gets, of that 10 mills, we get 4.8. The rest of it goes to other local municipalities in the city and the county, so on and so forth. And then there's 2 types of levies. You have fixed rate levies. The majority of our levies are fixed rate levies. Those are levies that are voter approved at a specific rate. They don't have much growth. They're very limited in their growth. They're protected by what's called House Bill 920. So as your property value goes up, House Bill 920 adjusts that millage rate down. And it's effective rate by class, and the rate can decrease, but it can't increase past its voted amount. So if the bottom was to fall, the economy and all of our home values dropped drastically, let's say by 100%, that effective rate would never go past the initial voted rate that it had. So if it was voted in, let's say the PI levy, 2.5 mils, which is actually not a good example. So let's use a different levy, a 7 mil levy that we have voted in. That is a fixed rate levy. It would never go above 7 mils. So if the economy fell out and everyone's house values dropped and it would push that above 7 mils, it wouldn't do it. It wouldn't be allowed. It's stuck at that rate. Our voted fixed rate levies total 67.8 mils. Because of House Bill 920 and the increase in the property values in our area, from property value increases because our houses have went up because of inflationary costs or because of new construction, which also plays in through this a little bit, that millage rate has been reduced down to 21.19 mils. So again, as the property values of the entire community go up, the assessed valuation goes up, the effective rate goes down that we see on our fixed rate levies. Fixed sum levies are a little bit different. Those would be your PI levies and your emergency levies actually. Those are levies that are voted in for a specific amount. We know that the emergency renewal that is on the ballot right now is for $15 million. It will always be for $15 million. So what happens is it has no growth. It can never go above $15 million because when new people move into the district or we have new construction or the valuation goes up, what happens is that millage rate's dropped so that it always collects $15 million. Back when we had the recession in the mid-28 through 2013 and we saw price values of homes dropping, you actually see the effective millage rate go up because it has to go up to make sure it collects that specific dollar amount. So it's adjusted annually for voter approval rate, and it's not included in the floor, which is the minimum level that we have to have by law. So there's a law in the state of Ohio that says that at a minimum, districts will always have 20 mils for educational purposes. So what's included in that is your inside millage and your voted fixed rate levies. Fixed sum levies are not included in that calculation. So we have two fixed sum levies. We have our emergency levy, what's up, and then we have our 1 mil PI levy that we have voted in back in 1988 and that was continuous in 2013. Those two levies together total 7.1 mils when they're adjusted for their effective rate, which gives us a total voted millage rate of 80.33. But again, because of the assessed valuation has changed in the district over time, the effective millage rate is down to 33.10 mils. So if I haven't lost you yet, thank you. If I have, just continue to do what my students used to do in chemistry class and just have the glazed look over your eyes and keep nodding at me so I don't call on you. The big thing is here, property values and tax rates, right? Because this is what we're all expecting. And we saw this back in 2021 when you got your triennial update. We saw about an 18-19% increase in our property tax valuations. The district did not see an equal corresponding rate on tax increases. Because as local property tax goes up, our school districts, again, real estate property tax remains relatively flat. What happens is our voted fixed rate tax levies decrease until we reach the 20 mil floor, and then they can't decrease anymore. And there are, interestingly now, right now, I just heard this number today, almost 400 of the 611 districts in the state of Ohio are at the floor, which means every time that there's an increase in property value, those districts are seeing a corresponding increase almost to, not exactly, but very high in those rates, which is why you're starting to see Senate Bill 153 pop up. You're starting to see House Bill 187 pop up to figure out ways to adjust potentially that and what impact that would have on local districts because property taxes are the main way that we generate revenue in the state of Ohio based on how we collect revenue for districts in Ohio. What happens is also those the fixed sum tax rates continue to decrease. They'll always go down smaller, smaller, smaller. That's why our 1 mil PI levy is now 0.38 mils. Because over the last 35 years, right? Did I do that math right in my head? We've seen it decrease. Because the property values continue to go up, the assessed values continue to go up, so what happens is that effective rate on that fixed sum levy continues to go down. So this graph shows us. So if you don't like numbers and you just like graphs, stay with me here. Follow the arrows. So in 2021, we saw a 19.6% increase in historical class 1, because we're our residents, so we're class 1 because we're property owners. But if you look, hit the slide again, Mr. Lynch. In 2021, the effective tax rate actually decreased by 13.23%. So your actual rate that you had, that you would multiply your assessed value at, down by 13.23%. So in actuality, your taxes went down that you paid to the district. What happened in 2016? Who remembers? Why did we have a 13.7% increase in our property taxes? That is a day that we cannot forget. That was in June. A couple months before that, in March, though, we passed our first new money operating levy since 2004 and 2016. So we saw an increase in our property tax rates of 13.6%. So that's why you see that blip on the red side, that you don't see anything on the left side that corresponds to it. So I'd like to explain differences. Mr. Lynch, if you go on the next slide, please. So what I'm doing as I do my November forecast is I'm trying to predict what our increases are going to be for the county in 2024, and what will that result in as an effective property tax change in that corresponding year. And then the triennial update again falls in this 5-year forecast. So now I got to predict 4 more years out in 2027 in a housing market that I have really no idea realistically what's going to happen. So right now, and this is just my draft forecast, I'm not done, I don't have to have it done till the end of November, and I will present it to the Citizens Financial Advisory and then to the board in November. I just have a placeholder of about 15.6% because I have a meeting coming up where we're going to talk to the county auditor, so I want to speak to him to see what he's thinking we're going to be more realistically at. But that 15.65% is corresponding to a 10.84% decrease in the effective millage rate. And that's important to consider because we're not at the 20 mil floor, but it's going to continue to push us closer to that 20 mil floor. Mr. Lynch, on the next slide, you've already got there. No, go back. There you go. They look the same, but they're different. Let's just say I'm completely off, and let's say that our rate increase for 2024 for all of our property taxes is actually going to be 30%. Let's say it's double. Does anybody think, after the discussion we just had, with show of hands, are your property taxes going to double in the amount that you're going to pay and the amount of revenue that the district's going to receive? You should all be shaking your head, no! No, you should not be shaking your head, yes. You will be in detention later. So what actually is going to happen, if you go to the next slide, we see so even if I'm wrong, it doubles. The black line in that graph shows the difference in revenue that we would see. Less than 1% increase in revenue for the district. So the district will see a very inconsequential increase when you're looking at a forecast and you're looking at the amount of revenue that we bring in, even if I'm wrong by 15%, which is, doubled the valuation. Again, because of House Bill 920, on our fixed rate levies, they're all adjusted down because of 920, and we only see that growth on our inside millage, which is the 4.8 mils. So that's the only increase that we'll see from a revenue standpoint predominantly. And again, all those fixed sum levies that any district has, and we don't have many of them, they'll just be dialed back down because they still got to collect the same amount of money. Mr. Lynch. Another graph to show. The black line represents if I'm wrong and it's at 30%, and the red is the draft that I have currently in my November forecast that says it's at 15%. We're broke in 2028 and we're near broke in 2028, either way you look at it. A $4 million difference doesn't allow us to be able to function and be able to do the things that we need to do to educate our students. So again, relatively flat revenues. Mr. Lynch. So what happens is you have a couple graphs on here. The top line where the arrow is the fixed rates. That's our 80 mils that we showed on that first slide. That's constant. It doesn't change unless we add something to it like we did in 2016. That's why you see a little bit of a slope up there. I got to go back, Mr. Lynch. I got to stand up. So this is because of the levy increase in 16, so we saw an increase in our total voted millage rate. And you see that down here on our effective millage rates. And as we see, as our valuations have went up, and we continue to project that they will go up, and this red line is the floor, that's the minimum, our district is approaching that floor, and then your fixed sum rate levies are outside of the floor, and you can see they just constantly go down, down, and down as valuation goes up. Mr. Lynch, next slide. So what you see here is our total revenue on the top versus our property tax revenue, which is that gold line. And you can see that there's not much change over time with those lines. They have a relatively flat slope if you're into math and numbers. That little giddy up that you see in 2018 is something that I changed when I became the CFO. Mr. Wilson used to classify his PUP and TIF payments in his property taxes. He was more of a big picture guy. I like to see things in their own respective buckets. So going back to 2019, because that was in my forecast, we made some adjustments to our books. So it looks like there was a decrease, but it's just how we classified property taxes from that point moving forward, just to, again, explain the difference. Mr. Lynch. I think these are powerful slides, because I say this all the time, but I'm sure it goes in one ear and out the other, is if we did nothing, if we didn't give another employee a raise, and they didn't get a step, we would still be deficit spending at some point in the future. And this is what this graph shows, because it shows that our average annual growth in total revenue is about 1.2%, where the annual inflation over the last 10 years has been 6.3%. And we're projecting into the future our annual growth will be about 0.5%, and average inflation is going to probably go back to normal because it's been a little bit wacky the last 3 to 4 years as we've all experienced. And we're assuming it's going to be closer to 3.6% over the next 10 years. So just based on the way that we fund schools, if you have a flat revenue source and you have increasing expenses, it's set up to have a levy cycle is what I'm telling you. So every district in the state of Ohio at some point, and on average it's every 3 to 5 years, has to go back to their voters to get a new tax revenue stream to be able to afford the increases that they're having for inflation and just cost of doing business. Mr. Lynch, next slide. So I'm a nerd, so I went back to 2002 because we often reference 2004 here in this district as the fiscal crisis, because it was, and it's apropos because this is the levy that is up for renewal, is the reason why we're here. So you see the blue line is our revenue, the red line is our expenses, and then what you have in 2004 is when we passed the levy. And you see this trough here, it didn't automatically go up. There's an explanation for that, because if you were here in 2004, we had to take out a loan from the state because we were in fiscal crisis of $17 million. So those were the 2 years that we were actually paying that loan back. So you don't see it really kick into its full bore until 2007. And then you see that flat line. You see some changes here because what happened in this area? This is the 10, 11, 12, 13, what happened to the economy? We had a recession, right? Property values dropped, we lose revenue. We voted in a new levy in 2016, so we saw that revenue start to increase. So what you have here is when you see revenue above the red line, this is when we're building up our cash flow, because at some point we know we're going to have deficit spending because it's just the way it has to work. And then when we see the expense curve cross the revenue curve, we start to deficit spend, so we bring that cash flow down until you have another increase in revenue. And you can see we've made some cuts here too along the way. And then again in 2021, because of COVID, our costs start to go up. And then in 2022, the peak there is because we made the decision to fund our out years in our capital plan until we had the financial resources to be able to do that through a permanent improvement levy in the future. Mr. Lynch, what I like to show is, because the common question that we get is, what have you done to tighten your belt? Well, the green line was in 2014, the trajectory of our expenses growth increase. The orange line shows what we've done over the last 4 years since we've gotten out of COVID to flatten that expense curve and to reduce our expenses. So I think it's important to remind everybody that we have the renewal levy on, which accounts for 13% of our budget, which is $15 million annually. We also have the PI levy on, which is to support our growth of our capital plan, which is to help us make sure that we can continue to do the safety upgrades that we need to do, as well as maintain our buildings. But it also allows us to free up the expenses that we're currently purchasing right now out of our general fund to a fund that was only specifically designed for those purposes, at the recommendation of a Citizens Financial Advisory. So the gray line that falls off the cliff in 2028 is our May forecast. The reason why it falls off the line is because the 2028 numbers weren't there. It wasn't part of the forecast because it stopped at 27. The black line represents our cash balance that I'm projecting with the assumptions that I've made now in my draft November forecast. It's not finalized yet. The red line is what happens to our cash balance if the PI levy passes. Because again, we can take some of the money, Mr. Lynch, can you go back a slide? From that peak in 2022, 23, we can take some of that money we've shifted out of the general fund into the capital fund to bring it back, because we won't need it, because we'll have the PI fund to support that plan. Go back, Mr. Lynch. And we'll be able to reduce our expenses by almost $2 million a year of purchases that we're currently purchasing out of the general fund, as well as reduce any necessary transfers in years 26 and 27 that are projected to help support our capital improvement plan. Mr. Lynch, can you go to the next slide? Because the question always goes to, that we always have talked about, because I've never talked about the PI levy without talking about the fact that we need to reduce costs, because at some point, again, we are going to need a general operating levy. And people ask, how do we know when that's going to be? It's because we have a policy. We have a policy that's been designed by Mr. Wilson and the prior board that's recommended on best practices from the GFOA, which is the Government Finance Officers Association, and the Ohio School Board, or excuse me, Ohio Association of School Business Officials, that says that we have to have a general fund cash balance of a minimum of 15%. So 15% of $114 million is our threshold that the board has said that we will not fall below is $17 million. We also, in that, have created a budget reserve fund. You know, the state often refers to theirs as a rainy day fund that can't exceed 5% of the prior year's revenue by law, and we get audited on this. So 5% of 110 from last year means that it should be about 5.5. We're a little bit short because we've been deficit spending, so we're not putting money into it. The only money that goes into that now is the interest on that account that it gets from the investments that we make. So we're about $5.3 million right now in that fund. So when you think about it, you know, I'm always trying to think ahead so that we're not getting to a fiscal cliff like we did in 2004. And the rule of thumb in our industry is 90 days of cash on hand is kind of where you want to be. If you're at 90 days cash on hand, you're in a pretty good financial situation before you'd want to look at having additional revenue beyond what we're having. So based on our November forecast, which does not assume the passage of the PI levy, and it could, I mean, obviously we'll know in a month where we're at. So when I present that PI levy repercussions and where we're at, when we have that, when we do the November meeting, we'll be able to demonstrate where we're at. We're actually, you know, looking at needing a new money levy no later probably than 2026. Because we really don't want to fall below 90 days. So we don't want to get into 2027 looking for money because it'd almost be too late. Well, if the levy passes, the PI levy passes, now we're looking at 2027, and maybe we can push it off to 2028 if we're able to continue to dial back and make the cuts that we need to make. So that would push a new money levy to 2027-28, which would give us 11 years, again, on the last general operating levy, maybe 12, when the typical life cycle of a levy in the state of Ohio is about 3 to 5 years. And regardless of what happens with the PI levy, we've only had one new money levy in 19 years, and that was in 2016. And we've done that by consolidating buildings, redistricting, keeping our staffing proportional to our student enrollment, because 80% of our budget is staffing. I did. So what's our daily cost? And I think this is an interesting slide, because I have 4 kids. There's nowhere that you can send your kids for $92 a day. There's no camp, there's no babysitter, there's nothing. So I think the fact that we can educate the students in Mentor schools for $92 a day is pretty impressive. And I'm going to leave you with this, Mr. Lynch. A couple other slides, because I always hear that we are highly taxed in Mentor, and I'm not disparaging anybody's personal belief on their own tax rate, but I think you have to put it in concept of where we are into the county. We're the 3rd lowest in the county, and I usually show us as the 4th lowest, but Dr. Glavin always reminds me that Auburn Career Center districts have to pay an additional 1.5 mils, which I've never included in my calculation. And then there are districts that are in the joint financing district, which also pay another $2 million in the taxes that we don't pay. So when you add the joint financing district tax rate and you add the Auburn tax rate, we actually fall below Riverside for the effective tax rates that our taxpayers are paying for education. And we are in the 3rd lowest. As Mr. Heath said, we're in the top third for education in the county. So I think that's a pretty impressive return on your investment. And then somebody asked me, where do we fall? You always talk about Lake County. Where do we fall in Lake, Geauga, and Cuyahoga County? So I asked myself this, and I had some access to some information, and that's the 45 districts that reside in Lake, Geauga, and Cuyahoga County. And I looked at their bonds and their permanent improvement levies. We're the one at the bottom in red. That's us. So when you take the effective tax rates for districts that have either a bond issue, which is used primarily to fund new buildings or major renovations, or their permanent improvement rate, in all of Cuyahoga, Geauga, and Lake County, Mentor Schools is 42nd. Only districts below us are Perry, and they have a power plant, East Cleveland, and Cuyahoga Heights.
Bill, can I ask a question on
Yep.
that? That's for bond and PI levies. What about the, other levies for general fund?
We're I think it was 30th, 29th
Okay.
or 30th out of the 45.
Thanks.
So bottom half.
Okay.
And then what happens if we pass? Which I think is a fair question. Where does that put us? If we add 2.5 mils to that number that we have currently, we're still in the bottom, 20%, and we move up to 36. So I share that with the board and the community, the fact that when you look at how we fund the maintenance of our buildings right now, we are drastically underfunded. The request to have a 2.5 mil levy still puts us in a very respectable place for the maintenance and the funding of our buildings. And it will allow us to have a set pool of money to specifically address the needs of safety and the maintenance of our buildings, while also freeing up the expenditures on the general fund side to push off the need for a general fund levy as we continue to make cost-saving measures that Mr. Heath and I have committed to at a number of board meetings in this coming fiscal year and the fiscal year after to push that off ideally to 27 or 28 with the passage of the PI levy. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Bill, do you know the $92 per day, do you know where we are compared to Willoughby East Lake or the other districts? Are they at around the same or?
Well, I would
less,
assume Willoughby, East Lake, and Perry have, I believe, a higher per pupil expenditure.
Okay.
So I would assume that they're higher than ours. But our per pupil expenditure is a little bit higher than the rest of the districts in the county.